Caring for someone with lung cancer isn't just a role, it is a journey filled with love, stress, strength, and a whole lot of unknowns. I'm Mitch Jelniker.
And I'm Diane Mulligan. Caregiving just doesn't get the spotlight it deserves. And today on Hope with Answers, we're going to be talking about what it's really like to be a caregiver. We're going to give you some tips and some resources and hopefully some ideas that might make caregiving just a little bit easier.
Caregiving is certainly something that touches each and every one of us, but we can prevent severe mental health challenges. We can prevent depression and anxiety. We can give caregivers the tools and coping strategies that they need to cope more effectively with the inevitable challenges down the line.
So what I think people need to know is that it's exhausting. It physically is exhausting. It's sometimes very mentally draining, but at the same time, you do got to find time for yourself and make sure that you find sometimes for yourself to do things so that you can keep doing that. And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Lung cancer is a tough topic. It's a disease that affects patients, families, friends, co-workers. But first, it's a disease that affects people.
Advances in lung cancer treatments over the last few years have made it possible to live with lung cancer for years after diagnosis.
The Hope with Answers Living with Lung Cancer podcast brings you stories about people truly living with lung cancer. The researchers dedicated to finding new breakthrough treatments, and others who are working to bring hope into the lung cancer experience.
On today's episode, we're joined by Dr. Allison J. Applebaum, a clinical psychologist specializing in psycho-oncology. She is the founding director of the Caregivers Clinic at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center.
Dr. Applebaum also has a new book out called Stand By Me, a guide to navigating modern, meaningful caregiving. She's both a caregiving scientist. I didn't even know there was such a thing, and that's so cool. And a family caregiver.
Well, Dr. Applebaum, thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. I got to ask, what was your goal when you wrote your recent book called Stand By Me, a guide to navigating modern, meaningful caregiving?
There's many reasons why I wrote the book, but perhaps the most important for me to share with you is I realized, and this was particularly when we went into lockdown during the pandemic, that we were at Sloan Kettering only scratching the surface in meeting the demand for psychosocial care for family caregivers of patients with cancer. And I wanted to do something much more to assist caregivers across the country, caregivers in the trenches, caregivers who do not have access to high quality psychosocial care, whose care partners are not receiving cancer care at a major cancer center like Sloan Kettering or MD Anderson. And so Stand By Me in many ways is a Cliff Notes version to the type of training and education and support and validation that one would get should they come to the Caregivers Clinic. And I wanted to make that accessible to caregivers across the US and across the world. So that's probably the most important thing for me to say about why I wrote the book.
What's your goal, Dr. Applebaum, of starting a caregiver clinic like this? What is it that you hope to happen? And have you seen any aha moments or amazing results from starting the clinic?
I don't just have one goal, not surprisingly. My mission for my career is to assure that no caregiver has to seek mental health care and psychosocial support outside of the hospital system where their care partner is receiving care. And the reason that is my mission is that we know that caregivers suffer. We know that caregivers are at risk for their own mental health challenges. A large and growing body of literature, both within cancer care and non-cancer, indicates that diagnostic rates of anxiety and depression and even post-traumatic stress disorder are actually higher in caregivers than the patients for whom they provide care. We know that the distress can be profound, and when it's left untreated, it can increase exponentially and not only have very negative effects on caregivers themselves, but certainly have downstream negative effects on the patients for whom caregivers are providing care. And so my goal in developing the clinical service I did at Sloan Kettering, the clinical service I've just opened here at Mount Sinai, and my mission is to have these clinics across the country, is to basically to prevent those poor outcomes. We can't prevent all distress, of course. Caregiving is certainly something that touches each and every one of us, but we can prevent severe mental health challenges. We can prevent depression and anxiety. We can give caregivers the tools and coping strategies that they need to cope more effectively with the inevitable challenges down the line.
You mentioned there are certainly some joys to caregiving, but there are also many, many challenges. For someone who's new to caregiving, what would be the most common challenges a caregiver might face?
Oh my gosh, there's so many challenges for the new caregiver. One of them is just the information overload. There's so much information coming to caregivers in the beginning, especially as patients and caregivers go for first and second and maybe fifth opinions. That could be very, very overwhelming, as can be the enormity of all the new responsibilities that can fall on one's shoulders. Now, for some caregivers, those are limited to, for example, just maybe transportation to the hospital. But there's many caregivers for whom all of a sudden a diagnosis and a treatment plan leads them to have to make a very difficult decision about working or not, making changes to their daily life so that they can be present to provide support with activities of daily living, with nursing and medical tasks that we are seeing. I know this audience here is well aware that we are seeing a significant increase in medical and nursing responsibilities placed on the shoulders of caregivers. And that can be really overwhelming for someone stepping into it and in the early phases of caregiving.
And I think along with that, while you're doing all that, there are some negative emotions that can come out, such as guilt or resentment, and definitely burnout. Yeah. What do you say to caregivers to help them manage those feelings?
Yeah, so guilt is one of my favorite emotions to talk about with caregivers. I think all of us naturally tend to learn to feel guilt. Caregivers are wonderful with guilt. In fact, I don't think there's a week that goes by in a clinical setting where I don't hear about guilt. When a caregiver says to me that they're feeling guilty, I'm usually hearing they feel guilty. Dr. Applebaum, I shouldn't be here. I'm not the patient with cancer. Or Dr. Applebaum, I shouldn't be here. I should be at his bedside. And in those should statements, the guilt, the woulda, shoulda, couldas, that's the statement I hear, that I should be doing something else. And on the surface level, a caregiver is saying that I am letting down my care partner by being here or not at the bedside or taking care of myself. But in reality, guilt is actually a very, very powerful red flag. And it tells us that the person that we are letting down or who we're about to let down is not our care partner, but ourself. And so what I encourage caregivers to consider is when they feel that guilt, when that comes up for them, to ask themselves the question of how and what way am I letting myself down? Am I neglecting my own needs? And how can I actually pivot and go in the other direction? Really, in many ways, guilt is a red flag that we need to improve our self-care. With resentment, so many caregivers, especially those early in the caregiving journey who feel isolated, may feel very resentful of their responsibilities. Perhaps there are adult children available to take care of a parent, but it all falls on one person. Perhaps there's other potentially available caregivers, but they're not stepping up. And that resentment makes sense. So the first thing I always do is validate that. It makes complete sense to be angry and frustrated, especially when one's life is being so deeply impacted. And yet we as caregivers do not have a limitless supply of energy. And it takes a lot of energy to hold a grudge. It takes a lot of energy to feel resentment. And so anything that can be done to release some of that anger and put that aside and realize that that is not serving us as caregivers is really, really important to do. I think the other category you mentioned, Diane, is just burden or stress, which of course every caregiver experiences. Every caregiver is going to experience burden for sure. But certainly if one feels like the distress they experience every day is interfering with their capacity to take care of their care partner, their capacity to work, and their ability even just to get out of bed during the, in the morning, then that's really a sign that more higher level of care, professional help will be needed.
One of the things we often see is sometimes the caregiver themselves, we see maybe their health, both physically or mentally, declining because they're giving so much. Because how many times we've seen a caregiver and they say, oh, I got this, it's a lot, but I have it. But what are the signs that caregiving is truly affecting your mental health more than you may realize.
I strongly encourage caregivers with whom I work to take their own physical health very seriously. That any medical problems that might be emerging do need attention. And yes, you mentioned that, I think we've all seen and experienced cases where caregivers do go on to have their own medical diagnoses diagnosed during caregiving. So I strongly encourage caregivers to view their own health as part of their repertoire of tools that they have in their tool belt, that there's no way they can continue to care for their parent or partner or child or friend if they're feeling their heart racing, in a difficult, in a more repeated way, that needs attention.
Can therapy then benefit caregivers? Is that something they should consider?
100%. I mean, this is absolutely 100%. And I think what's really wonderful is that there are so many what we call empirically supported interventions. That means psychosocial interventions that have data behind them that have been developed specifically for cancer caregivers. We know that no caregiver has the time to come to therapy weekly, every week at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. Like, no caregiver has a regular schedule to begin with, and no caregiver has the time to give it. Quite frankly, most aren't going to come, that in that fashion. But what we do know is that there's many interventions that have been developed that can be delivered very flexibly over telehealth, maybe a total of 6 or 8 sessions over the course of several months that can have just as a great effect or even greater than those much longer term therapies. And so engaging in support is really important. And going back to the question about what, the experience of new caregivers, I think it's really important, anyone who's stepping into the role, to evaluate their support network. And by that, I do mean your social support, your family and your friends, but also whether or not you have a therapist, you have a mental health professional in your network, someone that you can be with, even if it's just once or twice. You might not need ongoing care, but there can be great benefit to having that person on your team.
How do you tell caregivers, or what tips do you give them, is probably a better way to put that, about balancing their needs versus the needs of the person that they're taking care of?
Yeah, I think I titled one of the chapters of my book the House of Cards, the caregiving house of cards, because it is such a tenuous balancing act. And we as caregivers are asked to shoulder so many tremendous responsibilities, and there's only 24 hours in a day. The reality is that we cannot do everything at 100%. And so part of what's really important for caregivers is some acceptance to understand that if caregiving is added on to their life, then something else is going to have to give just a little bit. It may be that you can't work full time, or if you still work full time, you might not be able to give 180% of yourself. Maybe you give 120. You may not be able to do all of the social activities you once did. You may have to cut down on planning for, time away or travel, which of course is really, really hard. But I think it is important that we are realistic with the energy and time that we have. And when I say that too, it's remembering that self-care is protecting time. Self-care could be simply, I need at least a half an hour every evening just to myself, regardless of what's going on. But what you just brought up is one of the greatest challenges that caregivers face, which is, how do I balance everything I'm being asked to do?
My own experience, that when my mom was helping my dad, she was the caregiver, I would go on my days off, which really worked well because I could relieve her. It was as much for her as it was for him. But as we all know, some caregivers may live remotely or in a different state, or maybe they're not supported by their family and friends. What advice would you have for them if they feel isolated?
Well, there is certainly an increasing number of caregivers providing care from a distance, right? I think the pandemic really highlighted that fact, and it's remained and it's endured. Oftentimes, I think it's really important at the outset of a caregiving journey for all members of the care network, those who are on the ground in person and those who are remote, to create a list of every aspect of caregiving that needs to be attended to. And then what can be done is look at that list and see what can be delegated to those who are not in person. And often there are many responsibilities, ranging from providing financial support to coordinating various healthcare professionals to creating a meal train, that can be done remotely. And helping those remote caregivers to feel just as important and just as part of an integral team as those on the ground is a really important step. And again, I think communicating early on, one of the themes throughout my book and my work is how important it is that we communicating early on between those caregivers on the ground and those remotely is going to be very important.
I always, in a situation where all of a sudden a patient needs that type of care, especially at the beginning, everybody says, oh, just let me know what I can do. What a smart thing to have a list and say, here's the list. How do we delegate this out so that everybody does feel like they're contributing, but they're contributing at a level that makes sense for them? I love that idea.
I don't know if you read my book, but one of the things I say in my book is not just about delegating to caregivers or network, but that every caregiver should have that running list of everything, not just caregiving related, but like everything else in your life, like your laundry, the gardening, the shopping, the like everything else you need to do. Because then when your well-meaning friends say, hey, Allison, what can I do to help you? You can be like, well, let me just open up my list and tell you. And the reason I say that is that the more specific we are with our asks, the more likely we are to get our needs met.
Absolutely.
So you're saying it's when I'm not sure what, I'll get back to you. Not helpful, but you're saying, you know what? I don't have food after tomorrow in my refrigerator. Any way you can help with that, that's going to more likely get you a concrete, assistance.
I remember a friend of ours went to a person that we had all kinds of things set up for, but nobody had thought about them shoveling the walk. And so he went and set up a whole set of guys to make sure that the walk was shoveled every time it snowed. And they lived in Denver at that time, and it snowed all the time. So it really helped. So I think that's great. Tell me also about boundaries. How do you set healthy boundaries with the patient and maybe with the other caregivers in that network?
Yeah, boundaries are so critical. Again, going back to energy, I often will encourage caregivers to consider whether the people they're surrounding themselves with are draining their energy or buoying themselves up. Boundaries are really, really important. I think it can be particularly difficult to set boundaries with care partners, particularly those who are very dependent on caregivers, as was my father with me, physically and otherwise dependent. But there's always room for boundaries, whether they're time boundaries or emotional boundaries. Going back to what I just shared a few minutes ago, I think the best thing to do is communicate and to be clear about the boundaries that are being set. That way there's no assumptions being made, there's no misunderstanding. Dad, it's really important for me that I get tomorrow night off. I've been feeling really burnt out. I'm not going to come back to the apartment till Saturday. Is that okay with you? Being really clear about that, as opposed to my dad then feeling abandoned by me.
Right.
Yeah. You only have so much gas in the tank, right? So yeah, good advice. I'm curious, what are the long-term psychological effects of caregiving, especially after caregiving ends?
This is an important question. It's another topic that I'm focusing on in some of my research with bereaved caregivers that's happening right now. We know some of the long-term effects do include trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder in its most significant form, depression and anxiety for sure. For those who go through the death of a care partner, one could experience what we call complicated grief. Or prolonged grief disorder. There's some discussion about the language and the nomenclature, but the idea is that, of course, grief is very painful and grief is very normal. But when grief is unable to be processed healthfully, it can actually lead to mental health challenges. And this is, again, why support is so important. Just as I said, it was important for caregivers early on to assess their support network, both professional and personal. So too is it so critical for caregivers, particularly those whose caregiving journeys have ended through the death of a care partner, to evaluate what their support is.
Well, thank you so much. We can't tell you how much we've enjoyed this and learned a lot. So it was great. And we're looking forward to the research that you have coming out. When is it coming out?
This summer. We're looking at the data right now. So I hope to publish this fall the trial I mentioned with those 200 caregivers with some of those psychoneurological outcomes. And I hope to show something positive. We'll see. Yeah. And I do have a trial right now where we are following caregivers into bereavement. And what I'd like to show is that those who received a certain type of psychotherapy that addresses some of the distress we know is particularly critical around end of life will help those caregivers in bereavement.
Dr. Applebaum, thank you so much. Great information. Good guidance. We appreciate you. We're honored to be joined by a remarkable couple, Gail Fackler and her husband, Jim. Now, Gail has stepped into the role of caregiver with strength, with grace, supporting Jim through his journey with small cell lung cancer.
And together they share the daily realities of giving and receiving care, but also the love and the lessons that they've found along the way. This story is about partnership, patience, and the power of showing up for one another.
Gail and Jim, thank you for joining us for this discussion about caregiving. Gail, let's start with you. Take us back to the day Jim was diagnosed with lung cancer. What was the first thought that went through your mind?
The first thought when he said he was told he had cancer and he said, "I've got cancer," it was shock, disbelief. In that one moment, our whole world turned completely upside down. So just, I didn't even know how to respond. It's like, just sort of felt frozen.
And Jim, you know, for you, all of a sudden you're hearing that word. One of the things that has to go through your mind is, geez, Gail's going to have to really take care of me through this. What is that like?
It felt like a death sentence. Shock, pretty much like Gail. When the doctor came in and told me I had cancer, it just really threw me for a loop.
And Jim, to be thinking about being cared for by someone else, that Gail was going to have to kind of take over here. What was that like?
It's the same then as it is now. It's very, very difficult for me to accept help. Traditionally, I've always been helping others. So to have her take on 100% of what goes on our property, house, and everything, it's difficult. It's unnatural.
Yeah, because you all had split so many duties around the house, cooking and everything else, that yes,
Yeah.
that's completely foreign to you.
It is. And one of my favorite things was cooking. And now I can't really even do that.
Well, Jim, we're going to get back to you in a minute. And Gail, we're going to talk more about your side, the caregiver side.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, what is the hardest part about watching Jim battle this lung cancer?
The fact that he can't do anything, and I tend to oftentimes get resentful because I'm doing it all, and then I try to stop and say, okay, how is he feeling about this? And it's like, I know he hates that because he was so used to pitching in and helping and doing so much. And for him to be able to not do anything, it's extremely difficult for him. So I try to remind myself of that he doesn't want what he's got. He would like to have his old life back. So.
For sure. And so you've touched on this, but I'm curious how this has all impacted your marriage since the diagnosis. What things have become more challenging, for example, just in your relationship?
Pretty much everything. Communication oftentimes, because there are many days he doesn't feel like I think he doesn't feel like talking. He doesn't talk. He sleeps a lot of the day away. So conversations that we just used to have about anything, everything, things going on in the world outside of our home versus friends versus anything. There's so many times we don't have that. Intimacy there, that's changed dramatically. It's kind of not there because he's so weak and he just can't do things. So yeah, it's had a huge impact.
Well, and I know that for a lot of caregivers, they feel guilty over some of the negative feelings, and sometimes they even feel resentful. I just wondered, have you experienced this, and how do you deal with those feelings?
Absolutely, I've experienced it. Lots of resentment and guilty sometimes when I go out and do things and I know he's sitting at home by himself and I feel guilty about that, you know. But then again, it's like, okay, so am I supposed to not live anymore too? I mean, I don't know, you know, that's always a challenge, wondering about that. How do I handle it? Not well a lot of times. A lot of times it's feeling sorry for myself, or just again feeling resentful. Other times I get together with friends. I mean, I'm on a ladies golf league, so I do golf once a week. So I try to get out and do things, but sometimes I don't. I just want to be alone and not talk to anybody. So it just depends on the day and how I'm feeling.
Well, it's good to hear that you're getting out on occasion, because what
Yeah.
so often happens in the caregiving role is that you don't take care of yourself, both mentally and physically. So is that a challenge for you to focus on yourself and care for yourself?
Sometimes, I mean, I'm trying to take care of myself physically because
Yeah.
somebody's got to run things in the house. So it's like I really have to take care of myself. So I try to do my, my annual physicals and different things with that, and try to, one of the things that's therapeutic for me as far as the mental part of it, and is when I go for walks in the morning. Sometimes I have friends I walk with, if I've got one particular one, but if she's out of town, I walk by myself. And that's really therapeutic because I just, listen to the birds sing, the blue sky, look at nature, and it's just calming for me. And I come back and I feel somewhat energized after I go walking in the morning, because it's just quiet and peaceful.
And sometimes I think it's hard for people who haven't been in the caregiving role to really understand what it is you're going through. What do you wish that people would understand about caregiving?
I told Jim, my mother was always a caregiver. And I said, I'm not my mother. I am not like her at all. She just always had that role, and she was that kind of person. I'm not. I always thought I'd be the one being taken care of, and so it didn't work out that way. So what I think people need to know is that it's exhausting. It's just, it physically is exhausting. It's sometimes very mentally draining, so, but at the same time, you do got to find time for yourself, and make sure that you find sometimes for yourself to do things so that you can keep doing that. And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Then in the midst of all this caregiving, of course, you're still trying to, you're still focused on your marriage or your relationship, right?
Right.
How has intimacy in your relationship changed, both emotionally and physically?
Physically, it's kind of been by the wayside, but we a couple of weeks ago had a talk about that, because sometimes I'm just, I feel like I'm in robotic mode all day long. I got to do this. I got to do this. It's the things, it's the physical labor things around the house, inside, outside, whichever it is. And then the resentment built up. But I said, what I'm looking for from him, I know he can't help me, but I said, just sitting next to me, or, putting your arm around me, or just some sort of touch, helps a lot. It makes me feel like I'm a person again, and I am a wife, not just your caregiver, but I'm still a wife, because a lot of times I don't feel like a wife anymore. So it's just, for me, it's getting some physical touch. And so he's been working at doing that. He's kind of making him aware, because he thought I was looking for the compliments, like, thank you for doing this, thank you. And it's like, yeah, that's nice, but that doesn't still make me feel like a wife. A wife should be some intimacy, and for the age we're at, I guess, and the medical situation, or his health, that's a lot. That helps me a lot if he just gives me some sort of touch and stuff. So
That communication is so important, and making sure that you talk to your partner about the needs that you have as well. But I'm also hearing, boy, a lot of frustration. And I think that that's very common. What is the best outlet that you have when you're just kind of at your wit's end? What do you do?
different things, but sometimes it is going and talking to friends. We live in an awesome neighborhood where I've got quite a few friends. So maybe it's getting together with them and just talking, so that I can, in fact, one of my my elementary school friends, she called me the other day just by chance. Her husband's got Parkinson's, and she was venting about that. And it's like, oh my God, that's the same thing I'm going through right now. It's kind of the same things when she was telling me things she was doing. It's like, that's what I'm doing. So it kind of felt good to have some camaraderie on that, I guess, or to know somebody else. But the other thing that helps, well, walking in the morning for me. And the other thing is getting involved. We've been involved in some cancer organizations, which we didn't do initially, but getting involved in that has helped, because when we do get together on our Zoom calls or actually together physically at a summit or something, it's just so good to talk to others who understand where you're coming from and what's going on in your life.
They get it, and you don't feel alone, because you're not. There are many, many people in this caregiving role. So when you're with other caregivers and perhaps they're new at this, what advice do you give them? What do you tell them?
Be sure to carve out a little bit of time for yourself. And some days that is a challenge. There maybe isn't time to do that. Even if it's 10, 15 minutes of just at the end of the night, maybe reading or something like that, or making a phone call or something that you enjoy, music or something like that. But just try to find a little bit of time, even if it's very little, just for yourself, that you can have some peaceful, quiet time, if that's what you need. I mean, that's what I need, but anyway, just take time for yourself.
How do you keep the joy in your marriage and take time to have fun? What do you guys do?
I was thinking back on that. It's like, boy, joy used to be our travels. We loved traveling abroad. We loved doing that. And it's like, or just doing things, hiking or biking. We did bike trips. We did a lot of different things. And it's like, okay, we can't do any of that anymore, to the point of, and what's happened with Jim, just to kind of tell you, is his cancer is NED right now, which is awesome. However, the side effects from the cancer treatments is what impacted him, to the point he can't walk. His walking has become where he can barely walk. He can't walk without assistance. And his speech became slurred. So those are the things that happened as a result of cancer treatment. Joy is the small things now. That's what I have to look at. It's like waking up in the morning, and the first thing I do is listen to make sure he's breathing. It's like, if I hear him breathing, it's like, oh, we have another day. We get to spend another day together, So that's joy. Joy is, like I said, there are a lot of days he doesn't talk much. But if we have a day where we have an actual in-depth conversation about whatever it happens to be it the news, the politics, what's going on in the neighborhood, that brings joy. Just to have feels like a normal conversation versus other things, where it's no conversation, or I'm having to say, you need to do this, you need to do this. Because a lot of times it's a parent-child type relationship, and it's nice when we can have a conversation where it's more like husband-wife. So it's really the small things. It's little things today.
I think that's so important, that when you thought about it, that's what you came back to, because it is those little things during the day that sometimes we take for granted, that you don't take for granted so much anymore, that can really bring you back, right?
Right. And he falls a lot because of because of the fact he can't walk. He's lost balance, and he falls a lot. And so it's like, we get to the end of a day, and it's like, oh, nothing bad happened today. It's like, phew. So that's joy. It's like, we got through a day with no incidents. Yay.
That's a big deal. That's that brings plenty of joy, I imagine.
It does.
Well, let's bring Jim back into the conversation so we can ask him a few things about this whole process.
All right.
Jim, I know what moments make you feel supported or understood in this new role where you're being cared for?
She supports me, and the frustration comes through for both of us. Me because of the cancer, and her because of what she's required to do now. But she's really good at figuring things out. Things I used to be able to do, she now does.
So, Jim, tell me, what do you appreciate most about Gail, especially in her role as a caregiver?
How she cares for me and takes on these roles. I mean, even basic stuff like, where do we go to eat tonight? And she'll come up with something that used to be my job that I wanted to do, but because of my physical invitation, she takes on that role. So she helps me out a great deal. And that makes me feel good. And at the same time, I'm very angry and frustrated that I cannot do things I used to do. The cancer has changed our life dramatically. So we're trying different things to make it better. And it's something just as simple like a touch. And like you say, she appreciates getting recognized for what she's done, but what she really wants is the physical.
Like in a marriage, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's cool.
Excellent.
Well, we try to keep. I try to get more engaged. A lot of times, like she said, I just don't feel like talking because it's very difficult.
Yeah, I have a question for both of you, really. Are there unexpected blessings or maybe connections that have come from this whole caregiving relationship?
Well, I tried to be more engaged with talking about different issues.
And I was gonna say, and blessings probably for me are realizing in the neighborhood, because we've only lived in South Carolina for 5 years. We're really from the Midwest. So, but I have found in the neighborhood we are in, the blessings are the people we have here, because when different things happen where I need assistance, things I can't do, I can call, and they all just come, they want to help, and they come, and it's like, we're so blessed to be where we are in this community because people help us, in the little area that we're in. They're there to help us. We have a lot of different people we can call on because we don't have any family here. So so that's been a big blessing.
Well, it's always great to count your blessings, and it's clear that the two of you have done that. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I just want to thank you both for this interview, because you've been so open and vulnerable. And I can't imagine how many people will be helped by the fact that you really shared the way you did. So thank you so much for that. Make sure to subscribe to the Hope with Answers Living with Lung Cancer podcast. You'll be notified every time a new episode is available. So visit us online at lcfamerica.org, where you can find more information about the latest in lung cancer research, new treatments, and more. You can also join the conversation with LCFA on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.